TQL, for example, right? They're going to consider their training proprietary, right? Integrity Express is another similar style company as TQL, and they're going to consider their training to their new brokers proprietary. So there's not a big open market pool of education, which is one of the goals that we've had with Freight 360 is to create free stuff for people.
We've partnered with Ascend TMS, the world's most popular and top-rated transportation management system. It's the ultimate tool for all your freight needs. You can use our referral code RA-FreightCaviar ! To receive 3 months of Ascend TMS for free. It only takes 20 seconds to sign up and no credit card is required. You can click the link below to learn more. Welcome to the FreightCaviar podcast. Today, we're joined by Nate Cross and Benjamin Kowalski from Freight 360 alongside Reed Lucelot, who's our co-host today, subbing in for Mr. Bob Cruz. Welcome, guys, to the podcast. To begin, Nate, could you offer us a little bit of introduction about who you are, where you're from, and what you do?
Yeah, well, appreciate it, Paul. It's good to be on here with you. So I'm from Buffalo, and I've been in the freight world, I guess you could say probably a dozen years now. So I started with an asset-based trucking company about 12 years ago and transitioned into brokerage about 10 years ago. Got my start in logistics actually in the military. So I graduated high school close to 20 years ago, joined the Air Force, did some logistics work with like on the air freight side of things. And about 3 years later, went to college, did ROTC, commissioned as an Army officer, and I went the transportation route. So did a lot of service transportation maintenance, the aviation world, bulk fuel, convoys, the whole nine. So all I've ever done is logistics since I graduated high school, and that's pretty much been it. And then Ben and I met 3-4 years ago, joined forces, and Freight 360 is the massive conglomerate that we've built with our podcast, coaching, and all that good stuff.
Definitely. Very cool. Before we dive into your story, Nate, in the military, Benjamin, could you give us an introduction as well?
Yeah, originally from Pittsburgh. I went to school for finance and accounting and was in banking for the most part of, I'd say, the first 10, 15 years of my career in real estate and analyst and finance. And then I got recruited into logistics when I moved to South Florida. I was looking to go back and work in banking down here, and she got recruited into TQL, topic we were talking about in the green room a little bit. Had no idea what logistics was. And I was like, wow, super interesting to me. Love the market aspect of it. Love the economics. And it's like, and the sales and the fact that you can literally kind of make uncapped commission in a way that truly is uncapped. And to me, kind of fell in love with it and have been in it ever since. Started with a big box brokerage and then worked strictly in consulting to wait out my non-compete, and then back into worked for a few small brokerages. Now I work for an asset company, Weller Trucking, as well as a brokerage, Oakwood Logistics, and Freight 360 that I run with Nate in the coaching and consulting side. Very
cool. So you guys are both very busy. I mean, I've heard of Freight 360 for a while, and you guys offer a lot of good training and courses, podcasts, stuff like that for people entering the industry or just anyone that wants to improve their game, which is really fascinating. So just real quick, if anyone's here listening and they're looking to improve their knowledge about logistics, become a better freight broker, better customer sales rep, check out Freight 360 podcast. And now to talk about a little bit about the military and logistics, Nate, I'm curious if you could kind of tell us how that world looks like. I don't know much about it.
Yeah. So oftentimes people think that they're like the same, right? Like the public sector and the private world for logistics, there's definitely overlap, but it is extremely different. And I would say the main reason being, it's not like, the freight brokerage world that we see day to day in the private sector is free market, right? People are competing based off of price, relationship, and all of that. Whereas in the military, we're not bidding on each other. It's, hey, the Army owns X amount of trucks. This unit needs X amount of goods. Go do it. You know what I mean? So it's very different the way that everything happens. What I will say is a lot of the like the physical stuff is the same, right? So like your equipment, like your flatbeds, your low boys, all the hazmat, right? All the stuff that's actually used to move goods and the goods that are actually moved is similar to what we see in the civilian side as well. But the way in which everything flows and operates is extremely different. Does that give any insight at all?
A little bit.
Picking at.
Is there any there's no double brokering in the military, is there?
So no, but at the same time, there's a phrase called cannibalism, which is hey, if this I'll give you a very like Barney style version of it. So let's say a unit has a truck that's supposed to move a tank, right? And that truck is broken down. Well, you can quote unquote cannibalize another truck and take pieces and stuff off of it. So I guess that'd be the closest you'd get to double brokering is not putting it on the exact truck that you thought it was going to be on. But like I said before, the way that everything flows and happens, it's extremely different. You're not dealing with different private entities and trucking companies and whatnot. It's all owned by Department of Defense, right? There is some contracted freight business that the military gets involved with. Anyone who's ever done SDDC or DoD freight knows that. They've probably quoted stuff through the DoD and for SDDC, but in general, you're not going to see the fraud and the issues that happen. There's definitely inefficiencies because it's a massive organization with a lot of young people making decisions. So definitely a lot of inefficiency, but you're not going to see the fraud and stuff like that.
So because I don't know much about this, and I want to just make sure that to clarify it, the U.S. government has their own trucking fleet. Is that correct?
Has their own, they're not going to look the same way that you would see them. So, for example, and anyone out there that's listening will understand some of the terms and jargon I'm using, but a 915 is the model number for a semi truck in the Army, right? It looks just like what a standard cab would look like now. It doesn't have a sleeper cab. It's just a day cab essentially. And you could hook up, there's something called a HET is another, it's a heavy equipment transporter. It's a big truck that'll haul a low boy that'll put an M1 Abrams tank on it. So those same equipment, they're painted green or they're painted tan with a bunch of different, numbers and stuff on the side. But essentially, the military has their own fleet. There are entire battalions or units, to say it the common way, just full of trucks. You have like heavy equipment units where all they do is they haul tanks. You've got like maybe your medium transport units that'll haul Humvees and Strikers and some other stuff like that. And then you've got just general, like you might have a truck squad or a truck platoon that might only have a dozen or maybe 20 trucks. And it's designed to just be able to haul its own equipment in and out of a theater of operation. Whereas domestically, if like a unit is training or they're moving equipment across the country or they're moving it to the port to get sent overseas, there'll be a lot of third-party line haul operations. And that's where you'll see freight brokers and motor carriers directly getting involved in bidding on this stuff. So what you'll typically have is for an active duty military installation, there's going to be an installation transportation officer, or an ITO. Ben, you've probably dealt with them before, the TO for a base. If you're doing
I did,
military.
yeah. I worked on the other side. So I did the domestic side to what he's saying, and we would bid on the freight and use the domestic trucks in the United States in the open market to do the troop movements for what they would come out to bid. So from, 29 Palms to whatever, Norfolk, they're going to move 100, whatever it is, 150 truckloads. Nate's guys are probably the one putting together what goes in the trucks and what gets loaded on them.
Well, yeah, for sure. And then, so you have that transportation officer for an active duty base. The National Guard and Reserves, they'll tend to have like that National Guard, which I still serve in for New York, there's a state transportation office, and there's a single individual who runs that, who's in charge of lining up all of the line haul transportation for any units in New York State that are going to training or getting deployed or whatever the case might be. And it's the same process that you see on the freight broker side. We do it on the other side, right? We're submitting out a request for bids on, here's the volume of freight being moved, here's the timeline on it, here's any special requirements, give us your bid. And the military tends to have the same process. They're going to be required to get at least 3 bids on any purchase, in this case, transportation or freight spend. And they're going to go with typically, they don't have to go with the cheapest price. There is a lot of relationship decision-making behind it. People don't seem to think that, but it is very true. There is a human that decides who they want to award the bid to, but it tends to come down to, is the price reasonable? And does this carrier or broker have a good track record or a good relationship with us? And that's how you'll see third-party stuff in the US.
Okay.
If that makes sense.
What's the process like of getting set up? If you're a freight broker or a trucking company and you'd want to haul military loads, what does that process look like?
Hey there, amazing listeners. If you're enjoying what you're hearing on our podcast, we need your support. It will only take a moment, but it would mean the world to us. Please make sure to hit the like button on this video, subscribe to our channel, and don't forget to share with one of your friends that would enjoy our content. Your engagement helps us reach more people and bring more awesome episodes to you. Thanks a million, and thanks for being part of the podcast community.
I would defer to do a little Google search. There's a website, I think it's sam.gov. If I'm Ben, you might know it better than me, because I have never personally had to set up a freight brokerage to do DoD freight. I've worked at 2 now that have already been set up. And I've obviously been on the other side, but I've never gone through the process to register a brokerage or asset-based company with it. But I believe it's through sam.gov. And there's a process you go through to get registered as a approved motor carrier. There are some requirements to go along with it as well.
Definitely. I could imagine a lot of requirements on that. And okay, very cool. Reed, any questions on for Nate?
I could go forever asking questions about this, but I don't know if we want to talk about that the whole time.
What do you have?
My questions are obscure. I'm more so curious. Like, does each branch have their own? Like, is it like self-contained within each branch? Like, transportation, or is there like kind of the Army does it for everybody?
No, it's so it's both and, right? So you're gonna have the different branches all have their own transportation leg. So if, like the overarching agency is US Transcom, it's the Transportation Command, and below that you've got AMC, which is Air Mobility Command, which is the Air Force. You've got SDDC, Service Deployment Distribution Command for the Army, and then Military Sea Lift Command, MSC, is the Navy, their fleet, right? So they all have their own individual departments, but they will work together to get stuff moved, right? So you're going to have, obviously, if we're moving stuff domestically throughout the United States, you're going to use SDDC, the Army's ground transportation system, to move stuff. If something's flying overseas, you're going to rely on the Air Force. If it's going on a ship, you're going to either use the Navy or a third-party fleet that is contracted, because container ships will haul our stuff as well, but they're going to all work together. But then when you're operating in an actual theater of operations or a combat zone, whatever you want to refer to it as, any unit should, for the most part, be self-sustainable to move their own goods, but they will have either a sister or higher echelon unit that will be a resupply or support unit or designated group for them. So any unit should be able to self-supply or self-sustain for typically 3 days, 72 hours is the standard, and then they'll rely on some sort of other unit to bring them, to have transportation assets to bring them extra beans, bullets, band-aids, whatever stuff they need. So they're self-sustainable, and they have to rely on one another for everyone to operate efficiently.
Very interesting.
It's a big beast. And logistic, so people think about the military and they're like, oh, everyone's knocking down doors and, killing terrorists. And the reality of it is it's like 10% or less of the fighting force is the actual, your combat type units or troops,
basically the rest of it is all logistics, right? It could
logistics
be food,
is a broad statement, right?
It's just supporting the fighting force. That's what I mean.
Yeah, so
right?
Logistics is typically going to consist of your transportation, your supply, your ammunition, maintenance, things like that. In a broader scope, the sustainment phrase or grouping will include things like your medical units, finance, administration, HR, those type of things. And an even looser phrase is just combat support versus your combat arms. So there's a lot that goes into the sustainment and the logistics of the force. And that's why logistics is called the the spearhead, basically. It's the first thing that has to happen before anything else can go down, right? You can't send troops in if they don't have food and guns and bullets and all that stuff.
Yeah, definitely. I saw a couple days ago how like they were shipping, moving the tanks from like, I think Tel Aviv or up north of Israel to the south, Gaza, and there was so many trucks being moved. And real quick, because Benjamin, you mentioned that you had some also experience on the freight broker side of moving military loads. Can you kind of touch on that, of like the complexities of moving military loads, and what does that look like?
I did through two different functions. So I worked directly with the organizations he was saying, which was the SDDC and the DoD. It was at TQL. I managed half of the country. I had the Mississippi West. My partner had the other side of the country. And then we also did the same thing through Crowley. Crowley has the largest contract. It's actually, I think, the largest, not only transportation contract, but I'm pretty sure it's the largest congressional contract, is the entire logistics support for the entire DoD. It used to be the DFTS. I don't know if that's the name of the contract.
What's
now.
Crowley?
Crowley,
What is
Crowley
that?
Maritime and Crowley Logistics, right out of
Okay.
Jacksonville. It's a big 3PO, but they're also a shipping company. They were awarded that after XPO had it for like 8 or 9 years previous to that. All the major freight brokers kind of fought to be awarded, or 3PLs for that matter. Crowley won that around, I think, 18 or 19. And that was when I was still there and we managed that. So a lot of the military's business goes directly through Crowley. Crowley then distributes it to mostly asset companies based on the government's criteria. You know, everything from like women-owned businesses and minorities all the way to small business groups to the large companies, and they manage those metrics based on that contract. And then the rest of the stuff goes through the SCDC, which were primarily like troop movements and things that like Nate discussed, like, hey, we need to move this amount of truckloads from this base to this base. And it's usually over like a week period. So the bid process is the SCDC would send these out constantly, a couple times a week. And then everybody, they're just Excel sheets. And then you put in your trucks that you commit to and your rate. But what's really tricky with them is that when you go to move them, they move like project freight, right? So you quote it based on the market, right? Let's just say, what's the base in South Carolina, Nate?
Fort Jackson's one of them.
Okay. So say, because for some reason, I remember a lot of the ones that I had.
Well, they've all changed names this year too, so I don't know.
Okay.
I know what the...
So you got South Carolina to 29 Palms in California, right? And so you got 150 vans, right, that are going to go over a 7-day window, right? Like that's 15 to 20 trucks in some day. So you quote it based on what the market normally looks like. But the reality is when the government goes to move that amount of freight, they suck up all the trucks from the area. So it changes the market. It changes the rates. So you're really guessing what you think the market will be when they start moving. And the problem is like, you don't want to be one or two cheapest, because as soon as everybody else gets their money awarded to them, say all 4 of us get awarded lanes, we're all going to have different rates. Say you got $2,000 a load, I got 22, you got 25, and you got 27, and you get the most loads because you're the cheapest. Nate has the least. Well, if Nate's going to go move his loads the same day as you, right? Like he buys up all the capacity, and now no one wants to book your trucks, my trucks, or Reed's trucks. So then you end up with either fallouts or, trying with egg on your face. And the problem is if you don't get the trucks you committed to, then you can be black flagged from all of the military freight for like 30 days. So like there's a really high cost to not getting what you committed. And to be honest, the way they manage it, it really squeezes the margins out because of how they get distributed, because everybody goes to cover the same day, and it equalizes the rate. So if you don't bid right and you're not like 5 or 6 on the list with not the most loads, but the least, you end up making like very low margins. So you win some, you lose some, and it's a ton of time to bid these and then to manage them. So we did this for a few years, and I had a team just working on these, and they honestly just were never that profitable for that reason, because it is run really efficiently. They disrupt the market in a way that is very hard to predict. And unless you got trucks like in your pocket that want that lane ahead of time, because you got another customer that wants the opposite side of that lane, it's not that fruitful. It's far more effective to kind of run the freight through Crowley, because they can move to the spot market and they can pay premiums when they need to keep their service levels up. They operate more like a shipper than the way the SDDC does. Sure. The SDDC operates more of it's a very small bid and time frame, but it acts very similar to a larger bid, if that makes sense, but just higher costs when
and,
you
and
mess up.
you can't work with just any carrier either.
Correct. You have certain, just like any other freight broker, right? Like you got to meet your shipper's procurement requirements. And I can't remember what they are off the top of the head, but you have like
Crowley,
service
or
percentages.
you're talking about STDC?
For both, right?
Both, if I recall.
So Crowley, actually, we just onboarded them at my brokerage like 2 months ago, and they had just flipped a switch saying, if you are not asset based, they were not taking on any freight brokers right now, unless they were, designated as like veteran owned, women owned, minority owned, anything like that. We ended up getting an exception to policy based off of a previous relationship that one of our guys had. But previously they used to onboard brokers or carriers, and they just like turn the faucet off. And that's the freight market that we're in right now. SDDC, I can't speak exactly to what it is, but there are definitely, I think there's a time requirement that you got to have your authority for. And I would imagine there's some sort of like background check on something.
Well, there's like all the requirements to get onto a base for a driver, right? I mean, they have to be a citizen, I think, and they have to be
no criminal record.
You got a good story on this one.
You have something to say.
It was one of the funniest things about running military freight. You just reminded me was that, right? So there's the requirements, and they are background checks for drivers. And one of the things the MPs told us that they loved catching were drivers that owed back child support and had things on their records. And they wouldn't tell them. Like they would literally go out like they were checking in, and they would just walk out and cuff them and take them right directly in. And I remember talking to one of the MPs the one day at the base at like the check-in. I was like, hey, what happened? And he's just kind of laughing and explained the situation. And like we were able to fix it. It wasn't the end of the world, but he literally told us, he's like, oh, this like makes our day. He's like, when we're able to like basically kind of put somebody back into the system for avoiding paying for their childcare, he's like, it's one of my favorite aspects of this job. It happened a few times. I mean,
I'm just imagining like a internal like track and trace note at a brokerage being like driver was arrested at the pickup. Like
I've taken in a few and read a few. Yep.
Driver arrested, do not use freight guard.
Driver in handcuffs.
But it goes to policy, right? As a brokerage, right? We had to manage that, and you had to ask that question when you're running your check calls and be really poignant about how you asked and be like, listen, when we ask about background check, we mean anything, because like it is very likely that you will just get cuffed if any of these things are on your background. Firearms had guys taken in for that. I mean,
yeah, it's definitely risky. I've had I think a few loads that delivered. No, not delivered. I forgot the situation. I think it was more like I was waiting for a driver to get offloaded, and he was getting offloaded in a U.S. Army base, and like you really never know when that driver will actually get empty, right? Because it takes a while with all the paperwork and all that stuff. But so Benjamin, you dealt with the military loads while you're at TQL, and that was your, I guess, gateway into the logistics world. Can you kind of tell us how the 3 years, a little bit over 3 years, like were like at TQL, and a little bit of some stories or your experience with Ken?
I mean, to be honest, overall, my experience was positive, I would say, for the most part of being there, right? And again, a lot of it was because I was new to the industry, and I think the things that they do well is they are able to create a very, I would say, a good culture, in a sense that like you kind of enjoy being there. If you enjoy hustling and you enjoy the pressure and you really understand the environment, I mean, it's not a bad place to work. I mean, I have some of the closest friends I've met since I've lived in Florida came from working there. I mean, just being the camaraderie, they hire, they tend to hire people that have played sports, men and women. So it's lots of competitiveness. So like, again, if that's kind of like who you spend time with, I enjoyed that aspect, right? So again, the competitive nature, the culture was kind of work hard, play hard. And coming from sales, I thrived in that. So I didn't really have an issue. My issues came later in just the systemic nature of how it's structured, in the sense that like, you really can't grow in a way that is portrayed to you. Like they make it seem as if like it's just run in this direction and you can keep growing. And the reality is you can't, because you're funding your own growth as well as the rest of the company's expenses. And when you also start to realize that like how you're comped has a direct inverse relationship to your customer. And what I mean by that is the better I performed as a broker, the fatter my margins got, and the better I got at negotiating them and leveraging situations to do what I was trained to do, the more pain my customer feels. Every fat paycheck, every fat margin, I'm getting 25%, which is what I need to survive, right, to hit my personal goals. But my customer's paying 4 times that margin to get access to my skills and my ability that arguably I learned there. But you can only do that for so long before the customer's going, hey, this is great. We would love to work with you. But like, we literally just can't afford to on as much as we would like to. And then the work you do with them starts to get smaller and they work cheaper people in until it gets so bad that they come to you for the things that are really important, but never the day-to-day stuff. And that's really hard to build a long-term career in a situation like that because you can't change it. Like, it is what it is. So you can look for opportunities. And I think I was really effective at it. And I think one of the questions you had asked earlier was things that I did that I think led to my success. Everybody seems to be running in the same direction in a company like that, which is part of the culture, right? You got the leaders and the high powered brokers, right? The ones that are putting up the numbers, you look at them and see what they do. They're a produce company. They built their back and their income or their size on shipping produce predominantly. So that's what everybody wants to do. High margin, high risk. But what I learned real quick was I'm working amongst 6,000 other brokers, give or take, right? My competition isn't really the market. My competition is I can't call a lead until I get it in my name. My first competition isn't the market. It's actually my peers, right? So that creates, I would say, also a contentious environment where, I mean, they used to talk about like legit like fist fights and almost knife fights on the floors back in the day because of like prospects. And like, I seen some of them when I started. I mean, like literally like fist fights over who was going to get what truck, because that's how you earn a living. And if you get that customer in your name, it could be 6 figures next year. It could be 0, right? So, I mean, that has its downsides. What I was able to do was look where everybody was going and look in the other direction and find the things that most people weren't going after. Military was one, because it was a lot of barriers to entry, like you pointed out, a complex environment that takes time outside of work to actually understand, to operate effectively in it. Or like drayage, like nobody was really doing that 6 years ago, especially from the brokerage side. But there's tons of opportunity there, right? So that was another one that like internally they gave me a bunch of shit for wanting to do because they said it's low margin, you can't make money on it. But I was like, well, that's just because nobody's really doing it. I think there was, and it turned out that that was right. And I was able to build out their drayage department and all their SSL relationships, which then again, kind of ended up in the same situation. The better I did, the bigger their bills and expenses got, the more the next bid came around, the less they were going to utilize me, right? And that's just a recipe for like a hamster wheel, which was kind of why I stayed there temporarily and not for the rest of my career, I would say.
Got it. Very interesting. And those, what years were those that you spent at TQL?
Like 16 or 17 to like 19 or 20 around there.
Okay. And before we started recording, you mentioned that you met Ken a little bit, and Reed, I think you have another question as well.
Before we get to Ken, I just have a question about what he just said. You said, you know, the hamster wheel. Is that unique to like a company like TQL, like a big company where you almost necessarily run into this situation with customers long term, where you've done so well, you've got them, you know, dialed in, you're making a ton of money, and they're like, hey, why are we paying so much, and inevitably give freight away? I mean, is that inevitable at a company like that, or do you see something different in smaller companies? Like, what do you think of that?
So they are in some ways, yeah, a victim of their own success. So when you get that big, you are going to have that problem inherently. But to every problem, there's another side, right? There's an opportunity. So it's much easier to get a customer to work with you when you get them in your name because they've got name recognition and you've got lane data and trucks on every lane in the country almost every day. So your access to the market is unprecedented. The name recognition is there. The problem isn't that part of the sales cycle. It's how do you get the name? And then if you learn, you can kind of get that. That's a smaller hill to climb. A smaller company, it's the inverse. You got less access to the market, lane data and carriers to some degree, but you've got wide open space on where you can farm and where you can go hunt, right? And the second thing that I think is a much bigger advantage to the mid-sized company and smaller brokerage is you can play that margin game in a way that is still, I would say, fair to all parties. Like at a smaller brokerage, I can create value with my carriers and their network and how they're running efficiently. I can create value and margin by doing that so that they're making more money and running less miles. My shipper benefits because I have found efficiencies and what I was able to bring to them. They benefit by getting a little bit of a cheaper price, and I can make money in between. It's a win, a win, and a win. At the larger companies, they tend to only grow in the tight markets, and they tend to have attrition in customers as the markets are in where they're at now. So they're always laying off people. They're not really growing at all in the down markets, and they only win when the market gets tight and they can leverage their scale to get fat margins. And that has a shelf life.
Interesting perspective.
Yeah, that was a good question and a good answer. In regards to Ken Oakes, the richest man in Cincinnati, you did mention before we started recording that you visited him. I guess you visited the headquarters a couple times.
I did.
A little bit on that.
I've had a couple of run-ins. I mean, I met him personally when he'd been in Fort Lauderdale. Seemed like a nice guy. Didn't seem to be what you would think. I mean, he didn't come across as pretentious or anything. Kind of seemed to be like one of the everyday brokers. The one thing I would also say too about Ken is like he was notorious for being a workaholic. I mean, even internally and amongst his friends, like I'd heard stories like he was still brokering his first customers' loads well into like 2013 and 14. Like, I mean, once the company was well past the need to be doing this, and he would be on the elevator. And again, whether this was true or not, there was always the story internally that he never took a larger paycheck than the highest paying broker in the company. Like he would never get paid more than that. Now, again, with stock options and things, maybe that was just the paycheck side and he got comped in other ways, but that was always kind of like the internal thing. So, I mean, there's a lot of respect for him. I would also say that the culture inside there is very yes, man. I would say probably even similar to probably what I would expect it to be in the military. And one of the funnier stories was, so back to drayage, no one ever got onboarded with any of the major steamship lines at that time that didn't have assets, because part of their procurement requirements are UIIA. You cannot be a member of the UIIA unless you have assets, so it precludes non-asset brokers. Well, at that time, they were all reorganizing. This is like 2016, and I went and started prospecting Maersk and a few of the other ones, and I got them to the point where like we were at the finish line, except that they wanted us to sign off on unlimited liability to move their freight, because we didn't have trucks. I mean, they literally, the contract said, we want Ken to basically sign this and say that he will be personally liable if we need to, if something happens. And I remember literally asking the attorney, so I was like, so just for a crazy example, if we ended up with a container, because you don't know what's in the containers, by the way, they're all FAK. So you don't even know what's in them. And that was also part of this. And I said, so if there's theoretically $10 million in one of these containers of whatever, and it gets lost or stolen, like we got to cut that. And they're like, yes, that's what this says. Whether or not that would play out in courts, we would see. But that was how that deal played out. And that was my first real probably interaction with him. The funnier part of this was we had no drayage carrier base at the time, because like we were never working with any accounts that large. We moved a little bit here and there. So I figured out that the UIIA has a captive audience, right? You can get the email list of every carrier in the UIIA. And I was like, well, how am I going to get all of them this fast to be able to actually do this? Well, the other thing that happens, and is right as we get this contract done, 2 months later, the ELD goes into effect in December, blows up the whole market. All the carriers are super tight. You can't run anything. I started getting phone calls from Maersk, like literally from everybody in India at the time going, can you move this container? Open checkbook, whatever you need money, you can have it. We can't get it out. Containers were sitting there for 45 days at $300 a day. So they were paying anything to just get the backlog moved. And I'm like, how am I going to get this many carriers this fast? It's literally just me and like 3 people on my team at TQL, and nobody else had any idea. So I had the bright idea to create we'll call it a press release that I was going to send out to every carrier in the UIIA that formally announced that that TQL was going to be doing business with Maersk. So like the second or third largest freight broker is going to work with the largest shipper in North America. And I sent this announcement that I literally wrote and didn't ask any approval to every carrier in the UIIA. Well, quite a few of those larger carriers were friends with Ken, knew Ken, as well as knew some of the executives at Maersk, and some really high up. And by the end of that day, Ken was calling our GSM, and Maersk's executives were getting phone calls from their senior management, both telling me like, what in the world did you do? Like, nobody knew what I did. Just they're getting phone calls, and my boss comes over and goes, like, what happened? Ken is calling me and going like, these carriers are calling them and congratulating him on a partnership with Maersk. He doesn't know what's going on. I'm getting phone calls from the executives at Maersk saying, we don't know what we're going to do, but we think we might not move forward with this. Like, right as I'm at the end finish line, I've got like unlimited freight and open checkbook. I like pretty much thought I blew it up. It all calms down. Everybody like takes a beat. I didn't get reprimanded other than like a stern talking to. The irony was that email, right, that I thought I was almost going to lose my job over and blow this whole thing up. Everybody remembered it, every drayage carrier. So now that I had the freight, I could call through and send emails, and they all just recognized my name because of how kind of ridiculous it was. And it was kind of like a joke, but not. So I was actually, it worked in my benefit, and I was able to get the carrier base into the system much quicker because of it, in spite of the fact that it kind of pissed everybody off. And it allowed me to go blow that account up within a much shorter amount of time than it would to call every single one of them one by one.
I love that story.
To me, that always kind of reminded me of that story.
Is there like a lesson in your guys' freight broker course about sending ridiculous emails to win freight?
Press releases?
Press releases?
You know, it's funny. It takes me, there was a story I remembered in school. Our finance director told us this story, and for whatever reason, it always stuck with me. He goes, I'll leave you guys with this. He goes, whatever you do, he goes, if you do it big enough, you'll tend to fare well. And I remember even people asked him, like, so you mean like even if you fail in finance and lose a bunch of money, he's like, you'll get big headlines and someone will hire you right after. And maybe it just always kind of stuck with me in the back of my mind that it was just like, if you're going to try it or don't, right? Like, half steps are going to get you nowhere.
For sure. I mean, it's helped Reed and I in terms of social media content, just like, you know, putting content out there. People like the stuff that's a little bit crazy or, you know, doesn't really totally make sense, but people are intrigued. They want to learn more. They want to, they want to laugh a little bit. Yeah.
The whole concept of like no press is bad press, right?
Yeah, exactly.
PT Barnum. I don't care what you say about me. Just spell my name right.
So you guys got together. So Benjamin, you were at TQL. You left, I think you said around 2017-ish, around then. And then
I left around like 19 or
19,
yeah, I think around 19. I was there from like 16 to like 19.
Okay. And then Nate, how did you guys meet? How did you guys get together for Freight 360? How did the whole idea come about?
So Ben and I actually knew each other when he was at TQL. I tried to recruit him to come to the company I was working for. And anyway, fast forward probably 3 years later, I had started a small podcast in the fall of 2019 called the Midnight Freight Broker. I like to think I was the first podcast on freight brokering. It was very small. And then I transitioned from the company I was at to the company I'm at now and rebranded it because it had some affiliation with the previous company, made it totally independent. Ben and I joined forces while he was coaching for Southwestern, and we rebranded to Freight 360 and started doing the podcast early 2020, mid 2020 maybe. So we've been doing it together for 3.5 years, over 200 episodes, one a week. So it started as just, hey, let's do a podcast once a week, and we'll just talk about a lot of the common stuff that's going on in the industry. And what was really cool is at that time, it was, you know, everyone's working from home. We're in the beginning of the COVID, like the pandemic times, and people are consuming all of their information differently, right? They're doing podcasts now and they're consuming podcasts. So we got in at a great time and grew our audience fairly well. And we started to get noticed by some different players in the industry, DAT, the TIA. They're like, we want what you guys are doing. We want to be part of it. So DAT, in conjunction with them, they wanted some education created for basically one-on-one level freight brokerage training. And that's where our first course came from. The TIA, we met Ann Ranke when she first took over as CEO very early on there. And now for the last couple of years, we've been coaching their new broker success package and their private coaching series for their students and their new members. So along with Chris Jolly, the freight coach, he does about half of it as well. But we started to get ourselves integrated with the different folks that were out there that wanted education and wanted resources for brokerages. And that's really where it came from. I've worked in brokerage the entire time. Ben ended up getting back into it. And what I think is great is there's a lot of people out there that try to offer training and education in the freight brokerage space, and they don't work the job in the current day. And it's like, there's some benefit to someone's past knowledge and experiences, but if you're not doing it every single day, you don't understand the market trends and what's going on, especially like fraud the last 12 to 18 months. People, if you were in brokerage 10 years ago and you got out of it, you're not going to be able to speak to what it's like today. So that's why I think Ben and I have had a lot of success, is we do it as a side fun thing that we like to teach and coach other people. And we still love to work in the industry as the primary focus every single day. So that's kind of the story of how we got to where we are today. And we're not going anywhere. That's for sure.
Amazing. I love that story. Can you tell us, like, what's like the most common piece of advice that or insight that you tend to give to new freight brokers in industry?
Make the calls. So I think the one of the biggest things is like prospecting and lead generation. I would say that's primarily the biggest failure that people have. They either are doing it the wrong way or they're not doing it enough, if at all. And they just think that they can, there's this load board full of shippers that need loads moved, and that's just not the reality. You've got to go out there. You've got to find an effective way to generate good leads and then effectively prospect them for the long term until you can convert those folks to customers. So Ben, I mean, I'll let you hop in on that and speak to your opinion on it, but I think that's probably the biggest piece we have is the correct way to prospect.
Yeah, and I'd say it's preceded by like expectations, as Nate pointed out. I think a lot of people that jump into it expect it to be like you make a phone call, call a shipper, they're going to need your help, you offer them services, they give you a rate above market, you find a truck below it, and you keep the difference, right? Like, it sounds simple enough, right? I think that is one of the main reasons why lots of people that have these expectations that aren't accurate get frustrated and don't make it. Because to Nate's point, I've only met one person, and it's anecdotal, right, that I work next to, that made the calls day in and day out over a long enough period that he should have made it and didn't, like literally one. And that person has now gone into other sales, and he's now a high performer in another industry. It just wasn't a fit on the logistics side. I mean, I can't literally think of any person I've ever sat next down to that put an honest effort in, right, and did it day in, day out consistently for 6 to 8 months and weren't able to start creating some opportunities, right? And to Nate's point, you need the right guidance, mentor, friend, manager, whoever that can help guide you as to best practices. And then, it takes energy and output to execute it, because it's not an easy job once you get to that point. But I think those are the 3 fundamental reasons why people either make it or don't.
Yeah, I think I'll add to that too, because if you're an account rep, it's the amount of calls you're making and follow-ups to a shipper. If you're a carrier sales rep, it's going to be the amount of calls and reach outs to your carrier base to build both of those sides up. We have a lot of people that think they can just do this job part-time, right? So I'm going to be a freight broker as a side hustle, right? We saw a lot of this in 21, 22 when 21 and early 22 when everybody's making money hand over fist. There's just capacity's tight and everyone needs trucks. You got people that are like, I'm a real estate agent, I'm a freight broker, I sell life insurance. And they're like, yeah, I can do this part-time. And then when the dust settles and you realize, it's not a free-for-all anymore, this is not a part-time job, because your problems aren't part-time, and prospecting part-time is not going to convert you into good quality customers. That's just not the case. It might have been that rare exception post-pandemic shutdown, but it's not today. So yeah, absolutely expectations, doing the actual activity of prospecting. The other thing too is people need to be okay with rejection, because that is the majority of what a new freight broker has to deal with day in and day out, is being either being told no, or being, hung up on, being told no, given the runaround, we're only dealing with asset-based carriers, our freight's customer routed, every excuse in the book. You got to be okay with that and let it just slide off your back and move on to the next call. If you don't have the confidence and the grit to be able to just take it and move on, it's probably not a good fit for you. And I've seen people that did well in the height of the pandemic that when the dust settled, they couldn't cut it because someone else was better at this whole sales process and the rejection part versus them. So that's my take.
My favorite analogy to that is like, I heard somebody say this the other day, it was talking about surfing. He goes, it really shouldn't be called surfing, right? Because like 98% of the time you're just paddling, right? Like a very few, minutes of your entire hour, you actually surfing. And I'm like, holy shit, like that's sales. It shouldn't be called sales. It's a misnomer, right? Like it should be called rejection and getting punched in the face where you occasionally make a sale, right? Because that's really what most of your day is, right? It's trying to get people you don't know that are busy doing other things to pay attention to you, and then to make friends with them, to get them to want to talk to you enough to get it to the next step to actually maybe do some business, right? And most of those times they're going to be frustrated or rejecting you, right? And it's really hard, as Nate pointed out, to differentiate that from like a personal attack on you. Because when you're getting told no on the phone, it feels personal. It isn't, but it certainly feels that way. And that's really what wears people down. And also, I think very few people have careers longer than 3 to 5 years, even if they're good at this and they make a lot of money. Once they lose those accounts at the end of that period, company gets acquired, bought, whatever, their point of contact retires. They just don't have the heart to want to go build it again because it's a grind. I mean, like it really is. I've done it 5 times, build a book of business from scratch. I'm doing it again. And it's like, it's a lift. I mean, it is not for the faint of heart, but if you enjoy
There's
it.
something to be said about that too, is that I think a lot of people, when they, they get that one great customer, right? The golden goose, if you will, right? And they take their mind off of prospecting. And I've seen it happen way too many times. And that's why, that hamster wheel spins, right? And eventually that 3 to 5 year period comes and they don't have it in them anymore to go rebuild from scratch. Every single person that I've seen be extremely successful has always dedicated some portion of their time, whether it's part of their week or part of their month or part of every day, to continue to prospect. And that can look different to different people in different phases of their career. It might be that all you're prospecting now is good hot leads that are referrals from your existing customers. And that's wonderful, right? Or it could be you're newer and you're having to hammer the phones for 4 hours every single day until you can get enough freight moving to draw that back a little bit. But it's got to be not necessarily priority number one, but it's got to be a priority and a dedicated part of your week or your month or your day. Otherwise, you will ultimately lose a customer. They will go out of business. They will get acquired. They will have a turnover in personnel, and someone else that comes into that traffic manager job just doesn't like you like they like somebody else. And a number of things can happen. You've got to always be, replenishing that sales funnel, that, your pipeline.
Yeah. I'm currently reading The Ultimate Sales Machine. And in the first chapter, he meant Chet. I forgot his last name, but Chet says basically like, if you don't have customers, you should be dedicating at least 4 hours a day to like sales. And it's like, even if you have no customers or even a couple customers, it should be like, that's your priority, is to do 4 hours, like outbound reach and all that stuff. Very important. Reed, were you about to say something?
Yeah, I guess I'm curious. You guys also do a lot of coaching training. Like how important is training? Like, what do you think of the current state of training generally in the industry for brokers?
I think it's terrible for the most part.
Yeah.
I think
It's
one of the reasons why it's very, very, I don't know, poor or could be better, would say, is because it's very short-term incentivized. And I think that's because of the way the companies are structured as well. Like they have incentives that go to load per week or to revenue per week. That's important, but they never tie it back into long-term goals. So what you end up with is everybody staring at their feet, is what I kind of say. They're only focused on conversations right now. So all their conversations, when you have incentives all structured that way, are every day they're calling people, what do you have? What do your loads look? What are on your desk? What do you got to move? You got anything next week? And that's it. So they're never really building lasting relationships. They don't understand that you can do those things together. They're not mutually exclusive. I can build a long-term relationship with you and still ask about what freight you have. I don't need to sound like I have, like the saying is like commission breath, by being up your ass all day, asking you what load I can take from you today to move, to get what margin, to keep my manager happy by Friday and start the whole thing over again Monday, right? Like it doesn't have to be that way. It's that way because nobody wants to look at the way they're structured as actually causing some of the problems that they're trying to fix. And then they'll come to somebody like us and go, well, fix this in an hour or in an afternoon. And it's like, well, we got to take a step back and look at why this is happening in the first place. And the next biggest problem is most of those people have too much on their plate to begin with and don't have any time to work on their business because they're stuck in their business and they can't get outside to see that they are really a victim of their own decisions for the most part, I would say.
Yeah, I'll add in too. I think back to the question, like the state of training in our industry now, I think there's a lot of segmented views on, like, so TQL, for example, right? They're going to consider their training proprietary, right? Integrity Express is another similar style company as TQL, and they're going to consider their training to their new brokers proprietary. So there's not a big open market pool of education, which is one of the goals that we've had with Freight 360, is to create free stuff for people. And obviously there's paid stuff as well, but a lot of free stuff for new people to just figure out, will I like this industry? And I think further, I think the training, depending on where you are in your career, the focus of your training and personal development is going to look different. And I think there's a lack of that further down the road developmental training and coaching at a lot of companies, right? So if you're 10 years in, the stuff that you need to be working on for yourself is very different than someone that's brand new, right? Like Ben and I have been in this business long enough that we don't need to be trained on prospecting 101. We literally teach it, right? We don't need to be trained on it ourselves, but there's other things that we can do to develop ourselves. Things like being an effective communicator in today's world with the technology that's around us, right? Those are huge things. Management, leadership, dealing with big picture situations that you don't need to learn 101. But I think there's probably a lack of focus on that type of development and education and training in our space as folks go down the road. I don't know what it looks like. Well, Ben, let me ask you, for TQL, was there like a manager's training course that you go through when you hit a certain level, or what did that look like?
I mean, like, there's just like coaching for it. And that's what I was going to point out. The other big systemic issue in our industry is that rather than companies paying managers to be managers, because of the same problem, they look at everybody as a revenue generating employee. And if they aren't putting up freight and they're not putting up revenue numbers, they're costing money. And they're not, I don't think that is an accurate view, because then now the problem is your managers end up doing both. They've got to manage books of business while they're being a manager, but they're not really paid to manage. So they can't improve that skill because they're worried about losing their job by keeping freight on the board. So they're really just salespeople trying to manage. And the reality is if you only put managers in place because they were high performing salespeople, that is not a good indicator of management personality or even skill set or desire, right? Just because you're a high producer doesn't mean you want to be a manager, even if you would be good. So like, there's no criteria to evaluate the real skill sets that take to be an effective manager and an effective trainer or mentor to the people below them. They're just going, hey, get them to do what you were able to do. And we don't really know how you did it, so train them on how you did it, right? And that's it. Like, that's all there is. And I think that creates lots of other issues, right? Back into training and systemic issues, right? To Nate's point, this was one of the things that I didn't really understand when I left TQL. I was like, there should be more of this everywhere. And I'm like, if you could have access to the good things here without the bad things, then this would be fantastic. And that's literally what Nate and I set out to do, was take all of the stuff that we've learned from everybody and everywhere, best practices, make them widely available. Because if everybody cooperates, it really is mutually beneficial. The carriers win, the brokers win, the shippers can win. It doesn't have to be animosity, but everybody's so self-interested in protecting their cards that they aren't even benefiting themselves. Like, when you constantly treat carriers like the enemy instead of working together, you're also losing, right? And that was the other thing you would see in these big companies. I'm like, if everybody communicated what they needed with each other, do you know how many efficiencies you would find in a company that large moving that much freight? But everybody doesn't want to share information because they're scared the other person is going to take their customer, and they do, and that happens. So you end up with a situation where nobody cooperates. And Nate and I wanted to create a situation where you could have all of these things and still take a role in an agency model or in another job where you can literally create whatever life you want. I mean, you could literally make as much money as you ever wanted if you want to put the time and energy into it, or you don't have to, right? You can literally build that out in any way and however it fits your life and service the market in a way that everybody wins. And I think that, is where hopefully we can get to at some point, or maybe we don't, but.
I really enjoyed listening to both of you guys. I have like a feeling that like the courses have like very good like information in it. And just from speaking to you guys now, you could tell that like the knowledge is there. Like I learned, I'm learning a lot just from speaking to you guys, and I appreciate that. This is cool. Reed, anything to add on that?
No, I mean, I think that makes a lot of sense. I have seen basically everything you just described, especially with the manager. People, you're a good sales rep, therefore you're going to be a good manager. I mean, that's just very, in hindsight, very clearly not true.
No.
So no, yeah,
For sure. See, the sun came out in Arizona.
I would say to that,
surprised.
Reed, to your point, earlier in my life, when I was in my late 20s, I ended up in that position where I was a manager because I was a top producing rep. And at that time, I was a terrible manager because all I did was try to get people to do what I did. And guess what? People are different. And it is a horrible managing technique to just try to get everybody to do things the way you would do them. Like people aren't receptive. It doesn't work. And it just creates
nobody's
a disaster.
Nobody's you.
Yes.
But honestly, I mean, and I'll just say this, like the idea of coaching, like a year ago, or maybe even 6 months ago, I would have been like, I don't need a coach. You don't need a coach. We don't need a coach. But every professional athlete who's the best in the world has a coach.
Yes.
They all do. There's like not a single, like they all have coaches. And
you got to read this book,
need
$1 Trillion Coach, Read, when you get a chance. It'll blow your mind.
I'll look that up. But I mean, dude, like it's real. Like you need it. It doesn't matter how long you've been doing this. Like you have blind spots and you always can be improving. Yeah. And if your attitude is like, I don't need a coach, then you probably need it more than somebody who has one.
Yeah.
So, and myself included. So, yeah.
Michael Jordan, I think, had the saying where like he didn't want the coach to tell him what he's doing well. He wanted the coach to tell him what he's doing wrong so he could improve it. And he's like, I don't care what I'm doing right. Tell me what I'm doing wrong. So
it's just good to have an outside perspective that's not your own. Like one of the great things about Ben and I's relationship is we have each other to bounce ideas off of when we do it all day long, whether it's about Freight 360, which it's usually about something else. It's usually about our brokerage jobs and whatnot, but coaches, mentors, all of that, can you succeed without them? Yeah, but you're going to be missing out on, potential that you otherwise would never be able to get to just because you're too stubborn to take someone else's perspective and opinion and feedback and apply it to yourself to make yourself better. So huge fan and advocate of coaches, mentors, all of that.
Definitely.
I would say it's usually not. Yeah. I think it's usually more people are too insecure to realize that they have blind spots and they're letting their egos blind them. And I think that's one of the biggest reasons people don't do it. And that is one of the things that I try to work on is to every day find more of my blind spots, right? I'm not going to eliminate them, but if at least you start to get aware of where you tend to have your blind spots, you can start to notice when you're making, I would say, less than effective decisions, or you're like, it's probably a little more emotional than it needed to be. And I probably was in my blind spot. And if you can evaluate that, those are the things you can improve on. I mean, what fun is anything if you're not getting better at it every day?
Yeah, for sure. Well, so you mentioned that $1 Trillion Coach is a great book, Ben. Could both of you just kind of like tell us real quick, what are your favorite books and podcasts to listen to?
Podcast. Some people might not agree with me. I listen to the Ramsey Show a lot.
Okay. I never listened to it before.
Finance, career development, a lot of good stuff on there. So I listen to them a lot. Books. The 48 Laws of Power is one of my favorite go-tos.
I've read that one.
I've read it multiple times now. And, I've always got a copy nearby. Amazing book. What's the guy's name? Something Green.
Robert Greene.
Yeah.
He's got many great books, like the 33 Strategies of War.
Yep.
And then this like Mastery, all those. I read all of them. I love how he combines like history and psychology into one. I think he does a really good job. And then like he's got the laws of human nature that I'm currently like just kind of going through. Cool. Ben, what about you?
Sales side, This Influence by Robert Kowalski.
I have it as well.
The best books. It's about, he literally takes every sales job basically in the 80s and then breaks down the psychology of how the sales work. Yep. This is a great book, Atomic Habits, on
it's also great.
Just changing behavior more in line with what you want to accomplish and the little things you can do to make getting new habits in your life easier, I think.
Yep.
Two of the better books I've read in the past few years. Podcasts, Tim Ferriss, Lex Friedman, Peter Attia, My First Million, I listen to on a weekly basis, I would say. Andrew Huberman, I listen to a lot of. There's probably a few others that I pick up here and there. Those are probably the main ones that I listen to on a week-to-week basis.
Amazing. Well, you guys are awesome.
One I'll add in is, are you guys familiar with Andrew Bustamante, the former CIA guy that started like a consulting company? So Ben, when you said Lex, I thought about it because he had a really good interview with Lex Friedman about a year ago. But Andrew Bustamante, he started a podcast himself called Everyday Spy, and it's how you can take a lot of like CIA, and he's ex-military as well, take those tactics and skills and apply them to your everyday world, whether it's in sales or business. It's really, really cool. So that's another one. I'm curious. I want to turn around to you guys. Read
Founders is another good one too.
Founders is amazing. I listen to Founders.
Founders is great.
I listen to Founders. That's literally because I listen to My First Million almost weekly, and then when they interviewed David on My First Million about Founders, I think this was like in May or June. I literally just started listening to Founders, and I've been hooked on it ever since. I just kind of, because he's got so many of them and they're timeless. You could go to podcasts that were recorded a year ago and they're still so amazing. So that's been really good. Book wise, I guess what I'm currently reading is The Ultimate Sales Machine. I currently also read Discipline is Destiny by Ryan Holiday. It's a pretty good book.
All his books are great.
Yeah, Buy Back Your Time by Dan Martell. There's a few books I've been reading recently, but overall, I mean, favorite books I really like Shoe Dog. Shoe Dog was great.
Great book.
Yeah. Honestly, there's so many great books out there that and I know Warren Buffett, and I learned this from the Founders podcast. He spends all of his day reading, and it's all the most successful people spend their time reading to learn. It's and even Charlie Munger says this, who's Warren Buffett's business partner, and he's like, if you could learn from other people's mistakes, you're going to save so much time and be so much more successful. And it's just a mind opener. It's read books is so important in being successful. So that's me. Reed, I'll let you go ahead.
I'm probably different than you guys. Well, I know I'm different because I don't read. I really don't read much in the way
Reed
of
doesn't read
books. No, I read, but I don't read. I read, but I really don't read that much in the domain of nonfiction business type stuff. I'm reading a book on the Silk Road right now, which I like. Not the website, but the actual Silk Road. So I read a lot of history. I read some fiction. I read my favorite I guess business book, quote unquote, is, which I it's not much of a business book, but it is How to Get Rich, Felix Dennis. That's a pretty
read that 2 months ago.
Yeah,
great book.
Yeah, that's a good one.
I was reading that one
regularly.
as well.
I read that regularly. I just have it. I have a PDF. I just open it and I'll read it sometimes. I really like Stephen Pressfield. He's written some kind of historical fiction, like Gates of Fire, about Thermopylae, the Spartans. But he also has a book called The War of Art, which is really good. Paul, I think you would like that a lot.
Cool.
It is very good.
Very, very I studied philosophy in college. I'm a kind of a weirdo. So I read a lot of kind of esoteric stuff. Not that it does me much good. It's honestly probably made me more confused in many ways over time. So I maybe I should start, reading some of the books you guys are talking about.
I'll give you 2 books. Read The God Equation is a good book, and The Cosmic Game, 2 philosophy-sided books that I've read in the past year that are both really good. And the last one too that I'm reading right now, and is probably one of the best books that I might have ever read, is called Nonviolent Communication. And it's really about how ineffectively we all really communicate with each other in day-to-day life. Yeah. And there's lots of takeaways for business and personal life.
Yeah. Yeah. Communication is good. That's good. That is true.
Yeah. I love that you guys spend a lot of time reading and listening to podcasts. And I think that's very important. Awesome. Well, I really enjoyed this conversation. I know that we could have continued it for much longer and dived in a little bit deeper on some topics, but maybe we'll have to do a part 2 for that. Nate, Benjamin, thanks so much for joining us today on the FreightCaviar podcast. If anyone wants to learn more about Freight 360, could you tell them, or even if they want to connect with you personally, where should they do that?
Freight360.net is our website. There's a contact form right on the homepage. You can also email us info@freight360.net. We'll both get that. But Hey, our pleasure being on here. Appreciate it as always, Paul. And we'll definitely have to do a part 2. And Reed, good to join you as well, man.
Yeah, nice meeting you guys.
Awesome. Take care, guys. Thanks for tuning in to the Daily Freight Caviar podcast. If you enjoyed the podcast, or if you didn't, leave a review. Let me know what you think. I appreciate any feedback. If you'd like to have more Freight Caviar content, go to freightcaviar.com and subscribe to my email newsletter.